This is the final module in our series of assessments and evaluations for deaf and hard of hearing children, Part 2, School Age. And in this module, we're going to focus on some takeaways. So what are some reminders and guiding principles and strategies that you can, as parents, implement to help with making sure the assessment is appropriate for your child? So some reminders. Again, these are things you've heard already, but I'm going to reiterate them because I feel they're important. We need to make sure the assessment was sufficiently comprehensive to identify all areas of need. If not, we may be in that situation where our children are not eligible for services, and if they truly have some gaps, we want to make sure that those are identified in the assessment process. Were the assessments appropriate for your child's language, communication, and development? So we want to make sure that they take into account your child's primary language mode, how they communicate, and if there's any particular developmental needs that they have. If your child was not found to be eligible under Part B, you really have to ask what supports are going to be available for you under a 504 plan or under ADA. There's a system in place for both 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act that provide accommodations, which I think is sort of like leveling the playing field, but accommodations so your child can actually access their instructional program. So we want to develop a 504 plan that includes those accommodations. We need to look at ADA around effective communication and defined as effective as typically hearing children communicate. And we need to make sure that there's some mechanism in place that monitors your child progress, either during the year or from year to year. Some guiding principles. This will be a little bit redundant, but I want to take home these messages. Evaluation and assessment needs to be performed by specialists that are knowledgeable about the development and education of children who are deaf and hard of hearing. And they must be appropriate for each area that's being assessed. And consider that child's various language usages that they have, how they communicate, because some of our children communicate in multiple ways. They may use sign language in some situations, they may use listening and spoken language in other situations, so we want to make sure we're aware of all the different ways they communicate and make sure we account for that in the assessment process. Again, assessment needs to be of sufficient scope to evaluate all aspects of every area. So if we're evaluating language, it's just not a receptive and expressive language score. We need to look at how children use language, so things like pragmatic language development, how they use sign language versus English. All of those are components of a good assessment related to all aspects of that child's development. Then the interpretation has to be analyzed within the context of the impact of deafness, hearing impairment, or any combination of deficiencies. Many of our children have additional learning problems that need to be identified and, when possible, sorted out so that we can appropriately give them instruction by knowing what's caused by the hearing loss and what might be associated with some other problem that they have. Assessments must include non-academic measures, so looking at social skills, self-concept, self-advocacy, as well as some of the other areas that are unique for children who are deaf and hard of hearing, including that specialized instruction, looking at communication access, listening, speech, audiology, pragmatic language, American Sign Language. Some strategies to close. Start a notebook to collect and track your child's assessment scores in every area that's assessed. It's great if you can start this when your child begins services under Part C, the early intervention system, and then continue it through their education program. It'll enlighten you to look back on those scores and see the progress that you made. But also, it will help you identify areas where maybe progress wasn't sufficient and you need to go back and talk about what additional services might be helpful for your child. Be persistent about what you feel is best for your child and family. You know your child best. You know how your family surrounds that child and what the educational needs are. And with the school, make sure that you're getting the program that you feel is best for your child. Remember, good is not good enough. We want to be persistent so that we get the right services that allow our children to achieve their potential. So when somebody tells you, oh, they did fine on that test, you need to interpret fine as, is that what they're capable of doing, or did that just mean they did fine compared to a group of other children or a group of deaf and hard of hearing children? Develop an IEP that minimally results in 1 year's growth in 1 year's time. Some children need to make up more than a year, and so those children would need an IEP that's constructed to give more intense services to try and close that gap. But if the child's not making that kind of progress, we then need to go back and say, are the services appropriate? Is the placement appropriate? Why aren't we seeing the progress that we anticipated? And finally, know the laws and your rights. So much is embedded in these regulations that are helpful for parents as they pursue their child's education program. And by doing that, I think then you're on the road for getting good advocacy out for your child. With that, I'd like to close this series and wish you well on your journey with your child. There's lots of great things that are going to happen. There's going to be challenging times, but go back to the assessment data and use that to guide what kinds of decisions are being made by the school to support your child. And that will help with your advocacy efforts.